At my wedding, in front of 187 guests, my father picked up a microphone and turned my life into a joke. People laughed. My husband didn't, because 8 months earlier, he had started collecting evidence that would destroy my father's reputation. My name is Celeste Harmon. I'm 29 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I had learned the art of staying quiet. I learned it at family dinners where jokes landed like knives and everyone laughed except me. I learned it at milestones that should have mattered, but somehow never did. And I learned it best on the day that was supposed to belong to me. The day I walked down the aisle believing I was finally safe from being humiliated in public. I was wrong, because at my wedding, in front of 187 guests, my father picked up a microphone and reminded the room exactly how little he thought of me. He called my existence a punchline. He turned my marriage into entertainment. And in that moment, I felt the same freezing shame I'd carried since childhood, only magnified, echoing across a room full of people who didn't know my story, but were invited to laugh at it anyway. What my father didn't know was that my husband hadn't come to that wedding unprepared. What he didn't know was that 8 months earlier, someone had started paying attention. And what happened next didn't just ruin a speech. It unraveled a reputation, ended a marriage, collapsed a business partnership, and forced the most powerful man in my family to walk out of my wedding alone. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about what happens when the truth finally refuses to stay quiet. If you've ever been made to feel small by someone who was supposed to protect you, take a second to like this video. Subscribe if stories about quiet strength, long-held silence, and finally drawing a line resonate with you. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read everyone. Now, let me take you back to how this all began. The moment my father picked up the microphone, I knew. Not logically, not because I had evidence yet, but because my body recognized the pattern before my mind caught up. The tightening in my chest, the shallow breath, the instinctive urge to smile, even though I wanted to disappear. My wedding reception was in full swing at the Ashford Grand Estate in Napa Valley, the kind of place my father loved because it looked impressive from every angle. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, soft jazz floating through the air. Guests mingled in clusters, laughing easily, champagne flowing like the evening was flawless. My father, Richard Harmon, stood at the center of it all. Custom suit, confident smile, the posture of a man who believed every room existed for his performance. He didn't wait to be introduced. He never did. He simply tapped the microphone twice and waited for silence. "I'd like to say a few words about my daughter," he said. The room quieted. I felt my husband's hand tighten around mine under the table. Marcus didn't look at my father. He looked at me, calm, steady, like he was bracing for impact with me instead of watching it happen from a distance. "Celeste has always been a challenge," my father continued, letting the word linger just long enough to sound like a joke. Laughter rippled politely through the crowd. Not as driven as her brother. Not exactly the family success story. More laughter. I stared at the stem of my glass, afraid that if I looked up, I would break completely. "But today," Richard said, lifting his champagne, "I'm proud to announce she finally did something right." He paused, smiling wider. "So, let's raise our glasses to my daughter, who finally found someone desperate enough to marry her." The room erupted. Not everyone laughed. I saw my mother's smile freeze in place. I saw my aunt's face drain of color, but enough people laughed that it didn't matter. Enough people laughed that my humiliation felt official, sealed by applause. I couldn't move. My ears rang. I felt heat crawl up my neck. That familiar mix of shame and disbelief. Even on my wedding day, he couldn't help himself. He needed the room. He needed the laugh. He needed to remind me and everyone else where I stood. That's when Marcus stood up. He didn't rush. He didn't slam his chair back or raise his voice. He simply rose, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the projector setup at the side of the room, the one meant to display our engagement photos later that night. My father chuckled into the microphone. Looks like the groom wants to respond. By all means. Marcus didn't look at him. He reached into the vest pocket of his suit, pulled out a small USB drive, and plugged it into the laptop connected to the projector. "Thank you, Richard," he said calmly. "I do want to say something." The screen behind him flickered to life. "But instead of talking about how desperate I am," Marcus continued, his voice steady, "I think we should talk about what you've done." My father's smile faltered, just for a second. And in that second, something inside me shifted, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being asked to absorb the blow. I wasn't the one being told to laugh it off, to stay quiet, to keep the peace. Someone else was standing in the line of fire, and he wasn't backing down. I didn't know yet what was on that screen. I didn't know how far the truth would go or how many lives it would touch. All I knew was this. The story my father had spent decades controlling was about to be told without his permission. And whatever came next, there would be no going back. The truth didn't begin at my wedding. It began decades earlier, inside a house where love had conditions and silence was rewarded. In the Harmon household, there were always two versions of childhood happening at once. One was celebrated. The other was tolerated. My brother Derek was 4 years older than me, and from the moment he could walk, he was introduced as the future. My father said it casually at first, like a compliment. "That boy's going places." Then it hardened into expectation. Derek went to the best private schools. His tuition was never discussed, never debated. It was simply handled. His mistakes were called learning experiences. His mediocrity was reframed as potential waiting to be unlocked. I was raised alongside him, but not with him. From an early age, I learned the rules without anyone ever spelling them out. Don't interrupt your father. Don't contradict him in front of guests. Don't ask questions that sound like doubt. And most importantly, don't embarrass the family. My father, Richard Harmon, didn't need to shout to control a room. He had perfected something more efficient. He used humor. He used timing. He used the quiet threat of disappointment. His words were often delivered with a smile, wrapped just enough in charm that if you reacted, you looked oversensitive, ungrateful, dramatic. "Celeste's always been imaginative," he would say when relatives asked about my interests. "She's doing something in Seattle," when they asked about my career. "Derek's the serious one," he'd add, like a conclusion everyone should already understand. People laughed. I smiled. And somewhere along the way, I learned how to shrink without anyone noticing. My mother, Patricia, was always there physically. Emotionally, she existed in fragments. Soft where my father was sharp, quiet where he was loud. She smoothed things over. She explained his moods. She told me, "That's just how he is." As if that sentence could soften decades of impact. Looking back, I don't think she didn't see it. I think she saw it and didn't know how to stop it. Control in our house didn't come from rules posted on walls. It came from money, from timing, from who had the final word in every decision that mattered. My father handled finances. He handled plans. He handled narratives, and over time the rest of us learned to orbit around him carefully, adjusting ourselves to avoid collision. When Derek graduated college, my father threw a party, 50 guests, a hired band, a speech about legacy and leadership. He talked about the future of Harmon Automotive Group like it was already written, like the rest of us were supporting characters waiting for our cues. When I graduated top of my class, honors, every box checked, my father didn't attend. He said he had an important meeting. Later, I found out he'd spent the afternoon at his country club. I received a text message that night. "Congratulations. Don't forget to thank your relatives." That should have been the moment I stopped making excuses for him. It wasn't because by then, I'd already learned the most dangerous lesson of all. That approval was something you earned by being agreeable, by being useful, by being quiet. College was the first time the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Derek's education had been paid for without discussion. Mine came with paperwork, loan applications, monthly statements that arrived like reminders of where I stood in the family hierarchy. I remember sitting at the kitchen table at 18, forms spread out in front of me, trying to understand numbers that felt abstract and terrifying. My father skimmed the papers without interest. "That's just how it is," he said. "You'll manage." I didn't know then that money had already been set aside for me. I didn't know that questions had been deflected behind my back. I only knew that I was signing documents that would follow me for years, while my father's voice echoed in my head, "Be grateful. Don't make waves." So I didn't ask to see records. I didn't ask for explanations. I assumed the problem was me. As the years passed, the pattern deepened. Derek moved into a house my father bought. He joined the company with a title that sounded impressive enough to end conversations. Promotions arrived on schedule, detached from experience. Every success was magnified, every failure quietly absorbed. Meanwhile, I built a career elsewhere. I worked longer hours. I proved myself in rooms where my last name meant nothing. I learned to measure my worth in private because it was never acknowledged publicly. At family gatherings, my father's comments sharpened. They always landed just shy of cruelty, but close enough to sting. "Good thing you're pretty," he said once, laughing. "Someone might marry you." I excused myself to the bathroom and cried for 10 minutes, then returned and smiled through dessert. That was my role. That was how I survived. There were moments when the math didn't make sense. Small inconsistencies that brushed against my awareness and then slipped away. My grandparents, my mother's parents, had always been careful with money. Not wealthy, but intentional. They clipped coupons. They saved. They talked about planning for the future in ways my father never did. They passed away the year before I started college. At 19, drowning in coursework and loan applications, my Aunt Sandra Mayers mentioned something in passing. We were standing in her kitchen, mugs of tea cooling between us, when she said, "Your grandparents wanted to make sure you could go wherever you wanted. They set something aside for you." I remember freezing. "What do you mean?" "Your education fund," she said, like it was common knowledge. They were very clear about it. When I asked my father later, he didn't look up from his newspaper. "That money wasn't enough," he said. "It had to be used for other family expenses. You understand?" I didn't understand, but I nodded anyway because by then, questioning him felt dangerous. Not because he would yell, but because he would withdraw. He would become cold, distant, and somehow that felt worse. So I accepted his explanation. I never asked to see documents. I never asked where the money had gone. I told myself that if something had been meant for me, I would have known. That belief settled deep. It shaped how I moved through the world. College became a cycle of effort and exhaustion. I worked 2 part-time jobs alongside my classes. I stayed up late, studied harder, pushed myself because failure felt unaffordable in more ways than one. Every achievement came with relief instead of pride. When the loan statements started arriving after graduation, I filed them carefully. Monthly payments, years stretching ahead of me, a quiet reminder that my independence had a price. I told myself this didn't make me bitter. I told myself it made me stronger, and maybe it did in some ways. But it also taught me something quieter and more damaging, that I should expect less. That if I wanted peace, I needed to accept imbalance. That fairness was a childish concept, and family loyalty meant swallowing discomfort without complaint. By the time I met Marcus, this way of thinking felt normal. I didn't see my silence as a wound. I saw it as maturity. It wasn't until years later, months before my wedding, that the truth surfaced in a way I couldn't ignore. It came not as an accusation, but as a document. A bank statement dated years earlier, with my name printed clearly at the top. A transfer I didn't recognize, an amount that made my chest tighten when I saw it. I would stare at that page and realize that what I had accepted as circumstance had been a choice, someone else's choice. But at 18, sitting in that financial aid office, I had no way of knowing that my independence had been engineered. that the debt I carried wasn't inevitable, that the quiet lessons I learned about sacrifice and silence had been built on a lie. All I knew then was how to endure, and for a long time, that felt like the only option I had. Adulthood didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as responsibility. After college, I stayed in the city and built a life that made sense on paper. I found work in finance, learned the language of spreadsheets and forecasts, learned how to speak with confidence in rooms where my last name meant nothing. I rented small apartments. I paid my bills on time. I made decisions without asking permission. From the outside, it looked like independence. From the inside, it felt like survival with better lighting. I worked harder than I needed to, not because anyone demanded it, but because something in me believed that if I could just be undeniably competent, the questions would stop. That if I could prove my worth through output and precision, the quiet judgment I'd grown up with would eventually soften. It didn't. Each promotion felt like a small victory I celebrated alone. Each performance review that said exceeds expectations landed with a muted satisfaction, followed quickly by the familiar thought, don't get comfortable. Success, I had learned, was temporary. Approval even more so. At family gatherings, nothing changed. My father still introduced me vaguely, like my life was a placeholder he hadn't bothered to fill in. She's doing something in Seattle, he'd say, waving a hand as if my career were a hobby. When relatives asked questions, he redirected them toward Derek's latest role at the company, the next expansion plan, the future he was always eager to narrate. Derek had moved into a house my father purchased in the Willow Creek neighborhood. He drove a car that never came with a payment schedule. His job title sounded important enough to silence curiosity, even when experience didn't support it. And none of this was framed as favoritism. It was framed as logic. He needs stability, my father would say. He has responsibilities. As if I didn't. I stopped trying to explain myself somewhere in my late 20s. It wasn't a conscious decision. It just became exhausting to translate a life that was constantly being minimized. There were moments when it almost felt absurd. I would leave meetings where I managed millions of dollars, then sit across from my father at dinner while he questioned whether my job was stable enough. I learned how to compartmentalize quickly, to separate the person I was becoming from the role I was expected to play. But separation isn't the same as healing. I carried the imbalance with me. I carried it into relationships, into friendships, into the way I evaluated myself. I became careful, low maintenance, the kind of person who didn't ask for much, because asking had never worked in my favor. My mother noticed changes in me before anyone else did. She'd call and ask how I was doing, really doing, then fall silent when I gave her surface-level answers. Sometimes she'd sigh, like she wanted to say something but didn't know where to start. We never talked about my father directly. We didn't have to. His presence shaped every conversation, even when he wasn't in the room. Control doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it lives in what goes unsaid. By my late 20s, my life had settled into a pattern that looked stable from the outside and felt incomplete on the inside. I had a career I respected. I had routines that kept me moving forward. I had learned how to exist without expecting emotional safety from the people who should have offered it. I didn't see myself as damaged. I didn't see myself as deprived. I saw myself as realistic. I believed that this was simply the cost of belonging to my family. That love came with conditions, that silence was the price of peace, and that enduring quietly was the same as being strong. I had no idea that belief was about to be challenged. I met Marcus Cole on an ordinary night, which is probably why it took me so long to realize how much he would change things. It was January, cool and quiet, at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in the city. I almost didn't go. Work had been heavy, my patience thin, and social gatherings still felt like performances I hadn't opted out of yet. Marcus arrived late, apologized softly to the table, and listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was thoughtful, measured, like he wasn't trying to impress anyone. That stood out to me more than it should have. We talked about neutral things at first: work, travel, the kind of surface-level exchanges that usually fade by morning. But when I mentioned my job, he didn't pivot the conversation back to himself. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered details. He didn't flinch when I spoke with certainty. It felt unfamiliar, comforting, slightly disorienting. By the third date, I realized something else. Marcus didn't rush. He didn't interrupt my silences or try to fill them. He let pauses exist without demanding explanations. I'd spent so long adjusting myself to other people's expectations that being met with patience felt like a small shock to the system. 4 months later, he met my family. I told myself it would be fine. I warned him gently, nothing dramatic, just enough to manage expectations. "My dad can be a lot," I said, already minimizing. Dinner was at my parents' house, the familiar dining room with the polished table my father loved to reference whenever guests were present. Richard sat at the head, holding court as usual, stories about the business, casual boasts disguised as humor, comments that landed differently depending on where you sat. Marcus stayed polite, observant. When my father turned his attention toward him, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. "So," Richard said, cutting into his steak, "you're the new boyfriend." It wasn't a question. "I hope you're not planning to run off like the others. Celeste has a habit of scaring men away." The table laughed. I felt my face warm, the instinctive urge to smooth things over already rising. "Dad, I'm just saying." He shrugged. "You have to wonder what's wrong when someone can't keep a relationship past 6 months. Marcus didn't react. He finished his meal, complimented my mother's cooking, thanked my father for dinner, and shook his hand before we left. The entire drive back into the city was quiet, 15 minutes, then 20. He pulled the car over on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking softly in the dark. "Does your father always talk to you like that?" he asked. I opened my mouth to explain, to contextualize, to defend. The words lined up automatically. He means well. He's just blunt. It's not a big deal. But somewhere between thought and speech, they fell apart. Instead, I started crying. Not quietly, not gracefully. I cried in the way people do when something long-held finally gives way, my shoulders shaking, my breath hitching. I cried for 40 minutes on the side of the road while Marcus sat with me, his hand resting near mine, not pressing, not fixing. Just present. When the tears slowed, he asked another question, gently, carefully. "Do you know that the way he speaks to you isn't normal?" I didn't answer right away. I stared out the window, watching headlights pass, feeling exposed in a way I hadn't expected. The question wasn't accusatory. It wasn't meant to provoke. It was simply offered. That night, after he dropped me off, I lay awake replaying the moment. The way my body had reacted before my mind caught up. The way his question had landed somewhere deeper than criticism ever had. Over the next few weeks, small things began to shift. Marcus asked about my family without judgment. He listened when I spoke, and he noticed when I avoided certain topics. Once, when my father called during dinner and I excused myself instinctively, Marcus watched quietly. He didn't comment. He didn't tell me what to do. He just noticed. What I didn't know was that he was noticing more than I realized. He never told me when he started keeping notes, dates, phrases, the way my shoulders tensed at certain jokes, the way my voice changed when my father's name came up. He didn't announce it. He didn't frame it as protection. Later, he would say he just wanted to understand the shape of the problem before naming it. When he proposed in May, it wasn't elaborate. No audience, no spectacle, just a quiet evening, a simple question, and the sense, clear and steady, that this was someone who saw me fully and wasn't asking me to be smaller. I said yes before he finished asking. The next morning, I called my parents. My mother cried. My father's response was different. "I'll handle the wedding," he said. "Consider it my gift." At the time, it sounded generous. It sounded like relief. I didn't yet understand what it meant when Richard Harmon offered to take control of something public. And I had no idea that while I was trying to plan a future, Marcus had already begun uncovering pieces of my past I'd never been allowed to see. That realization would come later. For now, all I knew was that someone had finally asked the question I'd spent my life avoiding. And once it had been asked, there was no unhearing it. Marcus never told me when the shift happened. There was no announcement, no moment where he said, "I'm worried about your father," or "I think something is wrong." Life continued on the surface, work days, dinners, wedding planning calls that increasingly bypassed me and went straight to Richard. If anything, the months after our engagement felt louder, not quieter. More opinions, more control disguised as generosity. What I didn't see was what was happening in the background. Marcus began listening differently, not just to me, but to patterns, to repetition, to the way my father spoke about money as authority, not responsibility, to the casual way decisions were justified without transparency, to the things that were always explained but never documented. He didn't confront Richard. He didn't warn my mother. He didn't tell me. He started gathering context. It began with a phone call from my Aunt Sandra Mayers in early summer. She was preparing to sell my grandparents' old house, the one they'd left to her years earlier, and needed guidance on some estate paperwork. Marcus specialized in family and estate law. She assumed he could point her in the right direction. He agreed to review the documents. That's where he found it. Buried among bank statements and archived records was an account opened in my name years earlier. An education trust. The date caught his attention immediately. The amount did too. One withdrawal, one transfer. The destination clearly listed: Richard Harmon, personal checking account. The funds had been moved in full. Marcus didn't react impulsively. He made copies. Then he checked dates. He cross-referenced timelines. When he called Sandra back, his voice was calm but precise. "Did you know about this?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then she said quietly, "I always wondered why Celeste had to take out loans." She told him my grandparents had been explicit. The money was meant for my education, nothing else. When she'd questioned its disappearance years ago, Richard had shut the conversation down, told her it was family business, told her to stay out of it. "I was afraid of him," she admitted. "We all were." Marcus didn't tell me any of this right away. He kept looking. He pulled records related to Harmon Automotive Group, searching for patterns. What he found instead was a name he didn't recognize: Vanessa Grant. She'd worked as an accountant at the company for several years. Her employment dates overlapped perfectly with the missing funds. Public records showed she divorced in 2019. The reason listed was brief, clinical, devastating: infidelity with employer. Marcus reached out through a professional contact. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand. He explained who he was, who I was, and why he was asking questions. She agreed to meet him. At a quiet coffee shop in Palo Alto, Vanessa told him everything. 6 years, promises, private hotel rooms, messages she'd kept because something in her had known she'd need proof someday. She'd lost her marriage, her reputation, time with her children. And when Richard ended the affair, he moved on without consequence. She slid her phone across the table, hands trembling slightly. The messages were explicit, time-stamped, unmistakable. When Marcus asked if she would be willing to let him use them, she didn't hesitate. "I've been waiting years for someone to believe me," she said. "Use whatever you need." That night, Marcus drove home with evidence that went far beyond what he'd expected. Still, he didn't tell me. He waited. It wasn't until August, 1 month before the wedding, that he finally sat me down at our kitchen table. There was a folder in his hands, thick and unmarked. "There's something I need to show you," he said, "and whatever you decide to do with it, I'll support you." The first document was the bank statement. I recognized my name instantly. I stared at the numbers, at the transfer, at the date that lined up perfectly with the year I'd sat in that financial aid office signing loan papers. My chest tightened. The room felt smaller. "That's my college fund," I whispered. "Yes," Marcus said. "He took it." The next pages were screenshots, messages, promises, written by the man who had lectured me about discipline and sacrifice for as long as I could remember. Messages sent while he was married to my mother, while he was telling me to be grateful, while he was shaping our family around silence. I read every word. When I finished, I set the papers down carefully, like they might shatter if I didn't. "How long have you known?" I asked. 2 months, he said. "I wanted to be sure." "And what do you want me to do?" He didn't answer immediately. He took my hand instead. "That's your decision. We can confront him privately. We can tell your mother, or we can do nothing at all. I just didn't want you making choices without the truth." I sat there for a long time. For 29 years, I had learned how to endure, how to explain away imbalance, how to believe that silence was strength. But holding those documents, something shifted. "I don't know what I want to do," I said finally, "but I know I don't want to stay quiet anymore." That was the point of no return. The plan didn't form overnight. It unfolded slowly, carefully, over the next 2 weeks. One evening, as fog rolled in off the bay, Marcus laid it out. "Your father is going to do something at the wedding," he said. "He won't be able to help himself." I knew he was right. I'd watched my father work a room my entire life. A wedding, his production, his guest list, his platform was too large a stage for him to pass up. "So we wait," Marcus continued. "If he behaves, we deal with this privately later. But if he crosses the line..." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small USB drive. "Then the truth gets shown." I stared at it. 4 minutes of evidence, years of lies condensed into something that fit in the palm of his hand. "And if he doesn't?" I asked. "Then this stays in my pocket." I thought about my mother, about Derek, about the guests, many of them my father's colleagues, people who had built their impressions of our family on a story Richard had carefully edited. Then I thought about the money I'd never known existed, about the years I'd spent believing my struggle was my fault, about the 18-year-old girl who had signed loan papers because she was told there was no other way. "Okay," I said. We were ready. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for impact. I was choosing where to stand. The morning of my wedding arrived quietly, almost deceptively so. I woke before sunrise in a suite at the Ashford Grand Estate, the vineyards outside my window still wrapped in mist. For a moment, everything felt suspended, like the world was holding its breath. My dress hung by the window, ivory silk catching the first light. Beneath my makeup bag, tucked carefully into my overnight case, was a slim folder of copies Marcus had insisted we bring, just in case. The USB drive wasn't with me. It was where it had been for weeks now, inside Marcus's vest pocket. At 8, my mother came to help me get ready. Patricia looked older than she had a year ago, more gray threaded through her hair, deeper lines around her eyes. But when she saw me in my dress, her face softened. "You look beautiful," she said, adjusting my veil. There was no hesitation in her voice, no one correcting her. It was the first time she'd said those words to me without glancing toward the door. Outside, I could hear my father's voice carrying across the courtyard, decisive, commanding, unmistakably in charge. He was directing staff, checking arrangements, making sure everything met his standards. The projector, the seating, the timing. This wedding, like so many things before it, had become his production. By noon, guests began to arrive. Cars rolled up the long drive in steady intervals, business suits, summer dresses, familiar faces mixed with strangers I recognized only from holiday introductions. 187 guests my father had proudly announced. When I scanned the list earlier that week, I'd counted fewer than 40 names I actually knew. The rest were here for Richard Harmon. At 5 o'clock, the ceremony began. I stood at the entrance to the garden with my father's arm linked through mine. His suit was custom, the kind he liked to mention the price of. He leaned in slightly as the music started. "Don't embarrass me," he murmured. I didn't respond. The aisle felt longer than I remembered from rehearsal. White roses lined the path, candles flickering softly as the late afternoon sun dipped lower. Faces turned toward us, but I only saw one person. Marcus stood at the altar, calm and steady, his eyes fixed on mine. When I reached him, I noticed his hand drift briefly to his vest pocket, then settle again. The ceremony itself was everything a wedding should be. Vows exchanged, rings placed, promises spoken with intention. When the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," Marcus pulled me close and whispered, "Whatever happens next, I love you." For one perfect moment, I let myself believe that nothing else mattered. Applause followed us back down the aisle. My mother dabbed at her eyes. Even Derek managed a genuine smile, stiff but present. My father clapped the loudest, already positioning himself near the microphone set up for the reception toasts. The ceremony was over. The real event was about to begin. By 7:30, the reception was in full swing. Dinner had been served, filet mignon and salmon, my father's selections, not mine. Champagne flowed freely. The band played soft jazz while guests mingled between tables. Everywhere I looked, Richard was working the room, handshakes, back slaps, loud laughter at his own jokes. Then, without being invited, he picked up the microphone. No introduction, no cue, just two sharp taps and silence. "I'd like to say a few words about my daughter." My stomach dropped. "Celeste has always been a challenge," he began, pausing just long enough for the word to settle. "Not as driven as her brother. Not exactly the family success story." Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. I felt Marcus's hand close around mine under the table. "But today," my father continued, his smile widening, "I'm proud to say she finally did something right." He raised his champagne glass. "So let's raise our glasses to my daughter, who finally found someone desperate enough to marry her." The room erupted. Laughter filled the space, loud, unchecked, sanctioned by the man holding the microphone. Not everyone joined in. I saw my Aunt Sandra's face go pale. I saw my mother's smile freeze, her eyes searching the room as if looking for an exit. But enough people laughed that it didn't matter. Enough people laughed that my humiliation felt sealed. I couldn't move. The sound pressed in on me from every direction. I felt heat rush to my face, my ears ringing, my breath shallow and uneven. In front of nearly 200 people, my father had reduced my life to a punchline. This was his pattern. The joke disguised as truth. The humiliation framed as humor. The expectation that I would absorb it quietly and be grateful for the attention. For a split second, I thought I might stand up, say something, anything. But before I could move, Marcus did. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He simply stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the projector at the side of the room. My father chuckled into the microphone. "Looks like the groom wants to respond." "By all means." Marcus stopped beside the laptop, calm as ever. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the USB drive. "Thank you, Richard," he said evenly. "I do want to say a few words." The screen behind him flickered to life. "But instead of talking about how desperate I am," he continued, pausing just long enough to let the room quiet completely, "I think we should talk about what you've done." My father's smile faltered, just for a moment. And in that moment, something inside me shifted, not into anger, not into triumph, into clarity. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for impact. I was watching the truth step into the light. And the room had no idea what was about to happen. The room went quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like the air itself had stalled. Marcus didn't rush. He stood beside the projector, one hand resting lightly on the laptop, waiting until every last laugh had faded into uncertainty. My father shifted near the microphone, confusion flickering across his face before hardening into irritation. "What is this?" Richard demanded. "Turn that off." Marcus didn't look at him. He clicked once. The first image filled the screen behind him. A bank statement, crisp, unmistakable, dated years earlier. An account opened in my name. an education trust. Followed by a single transaction, a full withdrawal, the destination clearly listed. Richard Harmon, personal checking account. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the low hum of the projector fan. I felt my pulse in my ears, steady but loud, as if my body had decided this was something worth remembering clearly. "This," Marcus said evenly, "is the college fund Celeste's grandparents set aside for her education." My father opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. This is a misunderstanding." Marcus clicked again. "And this," he continued, "is where that money went instead." A few gasps rippled through the room. Someone at a nearby table leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Phones began to appear discreet at first, then less so. My father stepped toward the laptop. "This is a private family matter." "You made it public when you picked up the microphone," Marcus replied, his voice calm, unshaken. "And bank statements aren't opinions. They're records." He let the image stay on the screen longer than was comfortable, long enough for the reality to sink in, long enough for people to start doing the math in their heads. Then the audio played. My Aunt Sandra's voice filled the room, steady but unmistakably strained. She confirmed what the documents showed, that the money had been intended for me, that she'd questioned its disappearance years ago, that Richard had shut her down. My father's face had gone pale. "Turn it off," he snapped. "This is slander." "It's evidence," Marcus said, "and we're not finished." The next slide appeared, text messages. The sender's name was visible, Richard Harmon. The recipient's name blurred, but the content needed no explanation. Promises, plans, intimacy spelled out over years. Dates and timestamps lining up with family holidays, with work trips, with the life my mother thought she was living. A champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the floor. No one moved to clean it up. "These messages span 6 years," Marcus said. "They've been verified and notarized. The woman involved has provided a sworn statement." My mother stood. I felt her movement before I saw it. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her other hand gripping the back of her chair as if the room had tilted. 32 years of marriage collapsed into text bubbles projected for nearly 200 people to see. "This is fabricated," my father said, but his voice cracked. "For what?" Marcus asked calmly. "For showing messages you sent, with timestamps and phone records." The whispers had grown louder now, less shock, more calculation. People leaned toward one another, eyes darting between the screen and my father. The carefully constructed image Richard had built, successful businessman, devoted family man, was unraveling in real time. Then Howard Linton stood, my father's largest business partner, a man who had shared Christmas dinners at our house for years, a partnership worth hundreds of thousands annually. Howard didn't speak. He simply nodded once, took his wife's hand, and walked out. The sound of the doors closing behind him landed heavier than any accusation. Others followed, one couple, then another. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as people gathered their things, faces tight with discomfort. I watched the room fracture, the energy shifting from spectacle to distance. Derek sat frozen at the head table, his face drained of color. He didn't defend our father. He didn't stand. He stared straight ahead, watching the world he'd been promised crack open. My mother moved toward me then, her steps unsteady. She reached me and wrapped her arms around my shoulders, trembling. 32 years, she whispered. I trusted him for 32 years. I held her while she cried, right there, in the middle of my wedding reception. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. When I finally looked up, I counted empty seats. More were still leaving. The laughter from minutes earlier had been replaced by murmurs and the quiet tapping of phones. My father stood alone near the microphone, still holding it like it might anchor him to the room. Marcus walked over and gently took it from his hand. I want to be clear about something, he said, turning back to the guests who remained. I'm not desperate. I'm not settling. I'm the luckiest person in this room. He looked at me, and despite everything, the chaos, the grief, the exposure, I felt warmth spread through my chest. "Celeste is brilliant," he continued. "She's kind. She spent her life being told she wasn't enough by someone who needed her to feel small." He turned back toward my father. "You had years to be her father," Marcus said quietly. "You chose control instead." Then he addressed the room again. "If you'd like to stay and celebrate with us, you're welcome. If you'd rather leave, we understand. Dinner is paid for." A few people laughed, not cruelly, but with relief. The tension shifted just slightly. My father didn't wait. He walked toward the exit, pausing only once. His eyes found mine. For a brief moment, something like confusion crossed his face, as if he couldn't understand how his performance had failed him. "You'll regret this," he said softly. No one answered. The doors closed behind him, and the sound echoed through the room. I waited for the guilt, the instinct to apologize, the reflex to smooth things over. It never came. Instead, I felt something else entirely. I could breathe. And as Marcus's hand found mine again, I realized the truth hadn't destroyed my wedding. It had finally freed it. The room slowly found its balance again, not all at once, not easily, but enough that the night continued. By the time the band started playing again, the crowd had thinned. Some guests stayed, sitting back down with cautious smiles, unsure how to behave in the aftermath of truth. Others slipped out quietly, choosing distance over discomfort. Later, I would learn that a little more than half remained. My father was gone. Marcus stood beside me, steady as ever, his hand warm in mine. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I considered the question. My wedding reception had just detonated. My mother was crying. My family had fractured in full view of nearly 200 people. And yet I nodded. "I think I am." We cut the cake. It was vanilla, not my first choice, but I barely tasted it. Friends from college found me, pulling me into quiet hugs, telling me they'd always sensed something was off, even when I hadn't had words for it. My Aunt Sandra squeezed my hands and told me my grandparents would have been proud. Marcus's mother kissed my cheek and welcomed me into her family without condition. By 11:30, the last guests had gone. The lights dimmed. The garden grew quiet. That night in our hotel suite, my phone sat face down on the nightstand. When I finally turned it over, there were missed calls, voicemails, a text from my mother saying she was staying with Sandra and needed time, a message from my brother asking why I hadn't warned him. I didn't respond. For the first time in my life, I let the silence work in my favor. The fallout came quickly after that. My father's largest business partner ended their relationship within days. Others followed. Contracts were paused. Questions were asked. The reputation Richard Harmon had spent decades cultivating couldn't survive contact with the truth. My mother filed for separation before the month was over. When we finally spoke, she told me things I hadn't known, about debts, about fear, about the ways she'd learned to disappear inside her own marriage. She didn't ask me to fix anything. She just said, "Thank you for showing me the truth." My brother reached out later. His messages were tentative, unpolished. He admitted what he'd benefited from, even if he wasn't yet ready to apologize for it. We didn't repair everything. We didn't have to. We started with honesty. As for my father, I stopped chasing explanations. We negotiated repayment for the money that had never been his to take. I set boundaries clearly, without drama or threats. Limited contact, witnesses present, no commentary on my life or my choices. He agreed with a single word. It was enough. By the time I turned 30, the weight I'd been carrying for years had loosened. I paid off my loans early. I earned a promotion on my own terms. Marcus and I built a marriage rooted in respect instead of performance. I don't hate my father. That surprised me. What I feel now is clarity. Some people need others to feel small so they can feel important. That was never my burden to carry. My wedding wasn't the end of my family. It was the beginning of my boundaries. If you've ever been made to feel small by someone who should have protected you, I want you to know this. You're not weak for surviving quietly, but you're allowed to stop surviving and start choosing yourself. If this story resonated with you, please like this video. Subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your voice and setting boundaries that heal instead of harm. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read everyone. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I'm Celeste, and this was the day I finally chose myself.